Hello, I'm Tom Rogers and this is the Rebel Education Podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Rebel Education Podcast with me, Tom Rogers. In this episode, we're going to be discussing silent corridors. We're going to be talking about what this idea means, and we're going to be hearing from some special guests to discuss what they think about this idea of silent corridors. Just to kick off, a few days ago, Schools Week published an article with the title, "Williamson Calls for Silent Corridors and Banned Mobiles to be the Norm." This is referring to Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, who said, to quote him, "Reading and writing exercises are conducted in silence in the strictest schools, and pupils are given demerits for things like forgetting their pens or slouching in class." He also said that poor behaviour is dreadful for teacher morale. Having to deal with unruly pupils and disruption on a daily basis adds to their workload and stress. And he cites silent corridors, mobile phone bans, and teachers escorting pupils to classes after breaks as three strategies that he, according to this article, is promoting as some of the solutions to the issue of behaviour in schools. And I know that we've already, on my podcast and on various other blogs and articles, have discussed whether there is a behaviour crisis. Personally, I feel maybe crisis is strong, but I do feel that behaviour is a huge issue. It's still a massive issue in schools, and I'm sure if you spoke to parents, in fact, Ofsted did in their survey, and parents put behaviour and bullying and the welfare of their children in that regard, I think, top of the poll, or certainly in the top three, in terms of what they cared about from within their schools. Now, so my opinion on this. So first of all, what does it mean by the term silent corridor? This is about lesson transition. So we're referring to the time from one lesson to another in a secondary school context, because in primary school, there might be less changeovers, essentially. Less students moving between lessons. There will be some, obviously. But in secondary school, that is happening every 45 minutes, 1 hour, whatever it might be. So this is about saying between lessons, silence. In some schools, maybe when the first bell goes before form time, it might be come in silence, get ready in silence, and then transition into your first lesson in silence. Between first and second lesson silence, second and third lesson silence. It might even be that it's silence on the way through to break time, and then silence coming back in from break. And some schools not only have implemented the silent rule, but also they might have a rule where students are led in or re-registered, if you like, at the end of breaks. So first break and lunch, and then kind of led back in either by the classroom teacher or by somebody else, led to their next lesson. It might be in single file. And in some schools, they're doing that in silence. In many schools that have this approach, they're doing it in silence. And those schools are saying that they've seen positive results in terms of student behaviour from doing that. Now, my view on this. So through personal experience, I've worked in 2 schools now that have implemented the approach of lining students up and lining them in and taking them into lessons from the end of break and lunch. I've worked in another school that has implemented some silent corridors. Personally, I think any idea that works in a particular context and has reasons behind it is a good one. And I think that in the context that I worked in with the silent corridors in place, it was a positive thing. And the reasons were that it calmed students down between lesson changeovers. So give you anecdotal example. You dismiss a class at the end of a lesson and you've had quite a hands-on practical lesson with them where they've been up and about and they've been not running around the classroom, but they might have been very excitable, doing X, Y, Z. And then at the end of the lesson, they've kind of left very abruptly and they've gone straight into the corridor. And of course, there might not be a member of staff in the corridor to kind of on duty between lessons, and the students have almost acted like it's break time, and suddenly they've switched off. It's not very calm. There might be some shouting, pushing, shoving, and even instances of bullying can happen between lessons. So that happens, and then they turn up to the next lesson and they line up and they're not quiet. They might be disruptive before they've even entered that next teacher's room. Now, that's not necessarily the teacher who had the prior lesson. That's not their problem. They've been doing a hands-on practical, buzzy kind of lesson, and then the next lesson might be silent reading. And both of those teachers are just teaching their lessons how they see fit. And it's that transition period. And of course, the counter-argument to that would be, well, it's nitpicking, and it's micromanaging students, and it's draconian. And that would be the counter-argument. That would be the criticism that would come up against the silent corridors, almost micromanaging every minute of a student's day. And in some ways, there may be some validity to some of those arguments. However, again, it's contextual. So in many of the schools that have introduced either silent corridors or walk-ins at the end of lessons or these kind of strategies, they may have had a history or a problem with behaviour that they felt they needed to address. And those are strategies that a school could use to address behaviour alongside lots of other strategies, because and this is where maybe I have a bit of a problem with Gavin Williamson in terms of he's latched on to a couple of things there, which are, yes, they're strategies, but they are not the bread and butter, if you like. That's what happens in the lessons. That's what is the culture of the school that seeps through into everything that happens. So I understand people getting frustrated, and I would share that frustration that it's almost putting it into, it's almost flagging up something that is one singular strategy and presenting it as a hallmark, if you like, or an overarching thing that represents an entire approach to behaviour. I don't agree with that. I think it's one strategy. And also, I think that it depends on the context of the school, as I mentioned, because in other schools that I've worked in, there has been no need for silent corridors. And I think this is about need. Can it be an effective strategy? In my opinion, yes, because I've seen it in action. And also, I know that quiet and silence can help students to settle. So in my opinion, I think it can be an effective strategy. But I've also worked in other schools where there has been no need for that strategy. There have been other strategies, but that particular strategy has not been there, and they probably haven't even sat down and considered it. And that is also fine. I think some schools might be using particular behaviour strategies on a whole school level that no other school is using. Again, fine. And this is where there is so much nuance in this. And again, it's about context and it's about need. And that's why I think that it's very easy for people to kind of throw labels at schools that might use silent corridors, but they have never visited or worked in the school. So they don't know the historic issues. They don't know the issues that school and the school leaders who work there are trying to address and deal with. They're bound to be extremely challenging. If you're going for strategies like that, it suggests that you need to change something and you want to build something. And that can be extremely challenging in many school contexts, but in others, less challenging. So therefore, it might be that strategy is not appropriate or not needed or not wanted. So I guess, to summarise, my view is kind of pragmatic on it. The strategy itself, personally, I don't have a problem with it. But I think that context is key, and that's the same in anything, whether it's pedagogy, behaviour, or whatever is being discussed. Context is key, pragmatism, flexibility, and respecting what professionals are doing in their school contexts and why they're doing it. So that's my view on silent corridors. But as always with my podcast, I want to get differing views and different views on silent corridors. So I'm lucky on this podcast that I've got a few special guests who are going to share what they think about this issue. And of course, we've got very different opinions and different views that are going to be expressed on this idea. So let's listen to them now, and then I'll wrap up the podcast with a kind of plenary at the end.
My name is Damon Hesford, and I'm a secondary school English teacher from Bolton. I've tried really hard to understand silent corridors, and there is, as far as I can see, absolutely no reason to have a silent corridor. Behaviour, if it is that bad that it requires you to instruct students to walk silently from one place to another, and you cannot trust them to make their way to a lesson with unless they are in total silence. But behaviour needs to be looked at on another level. The problem isn't what happens on the corridor. The problem is the behaviour management policy, or the strength of staff, or the leadership of the school, or the recruitment, or, heaven forbid, parental influences at home or lack thereof. But none of those problems are fixed with a silent corridor. It looks great. It looks fantastic when people come into your school. It's a quirky alternative to what we expect and what we're used to, corridor to corridor, school to school. But apart from looking interesting and different, I don't know what it achieves. People talk about behaviour improving, which means outcomes improve. Right, we'll sort your behaviour policy out instead of making people walk silently from lesson to lesson. Trust students to make that journey and not be criminals or fools or feral or whatever it is you assume they are going to be, unless you can instruct their, talking ability. I think also what you've got to do is understand that the environment you create in a silent corridor or a silent walk experience is in no way true to real life. When they enter the adult world, they are not going to experience silent walking unless they go to prison or exist in Soviet Russia in the 1930s. And I'm assuming that's not what we want for any of our children. Silent corridors don't work. It's that simple, and they serve no purpose whatsoever.
Good afternoon, my name's Liam Smyth and I'm the Assistant Principal for Behaviour and Engagement at an inner London secondary school. I first moved to a school 7 years ago that used the policy of silent walking in the corridors, and I really thought that it was quite robotic and demon headmaster-like, and it was a very weird experience at the beginning. But after getting used to it, it really showed me how influential and positive it can be for all aspects of school life, for teachers and especially students. What we do at our school is, before school, at break time and at lunchtime, the teacher will collect your class from the playground. A hand signal will go up and students will get into their line in the playground within 10 seconds in silence. You will then walk your class up the stairs or to your classroom in silence, and every kid will be on a warning. So if they speak, they will automatically get a 20-minute detention for that day. Between lessons, you line up your class and then you walk them to their next lesson, and that again is all in silence. And students receive detentions that escalate. So if they talk more than once in a week, it's a 1 hour, twice in a week, it's a 2 hour detention. And the reason behind this is it creates a very calm atmosphere within the school. Every single lesson starts at the same time. Within 1 minute, all students, because they've been taken by their teacher at the same time, will all start or be on their starter straight away, and there's no wasted time. It's also quite positive for the teacher, who can talk to students on the way to their lesson, give pep talks for students, and give them questions to think about whilst they're walking to their lesson. There's also no physical contact, no chance of any bullying, name calling, and all students feel safe because they're in a calm environment, and they're all in a position where they can just simply focus on that lesson. There are no distractions from noise when classes or students walk by between lessons. And whilst I look back fondly at the kind of madness that I would get up to during between lessons when I was at school, the policy really puts the kind of collective spirit at the heart, and really allows for teachers to kind of take ownership of their lessons, and for students to have a school where there is no noise that it is negative, and that they can really just focus again on being in school and focus on their learning. So I think it is a really good thing to implement. It has to be done well, and it has to be done with the full support of all the staff, which we have. And that's why we rarely have any detentions, because the students are so well drilled, and they kind of buy into it, because they really see the benefit when every lesson starts on time. Every teacher is prepared, and every teacher has the ability to just talk to all students throughout the day, because it's such a calm place.
Hi everyone, my name is Cheryl and I tweet as Cheryll Kidd. I feel strongly about the issues that are being discussed in education at the moment concerning behaviour management. On the one hand, there are schools who rely on strict behaviour policies. This might include zero tolerance and no excuses to help with behaviour management. Their policies include banning mobile phones, humiliating children for misdemeanours and silent corridors. Isolation booths may be used to control what are perceived to be undesirable behaviours. Then there are schools where children have a much freer rein, and as a result these schools may be criticised for disruption in learning due to behaviour. On Friday, the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, intervened and said that he wished to see silent corridors and similar strict policies implemented in schools as the norm. Well, my post this weekend discusses this idea, and I have come to the conclusion that silent corridors as a standalone policy are not such a bad idea. For some children, such as those with autism and other special educational needs, they may be an excellent idea. These are the children who need quiet and calm spaces to get them ready for their next lesson. Also, having silent and orderly corridors is a good thing for most mainstream children and is conducive to good learning in their next lesson. What I really object to is the lack of trust of highly trained teachers and leaders. Surely, as teachers and leaders in our own schools, we know our children better than any DFE official person. Should we not be able to decide for ourselves what is best for our own cohort of children without being dictated to from on high? A good solution to behaviour management, as my colleague Helen has pointed out, is to be clear and consistent in your expectations of behaviour at all times. Build relationships with the children, build relationships with the family, be kind to the children, trust the child, and once you have the trust of the child, be there for them always. On the question of silent corridors, maybe we could accommodate the needs of all children by having quiet corridors rather than silent corridors. Just a thought.
3 things. Firstly, what the hell is the Minister for Education doing telling all schools across the country that they should have silent corridors? It's not up to him. Secondly, silent corridors means diddly squat if the culture of that school puts off children with SEND applying by saying, oh, we can't cater for your needs. Silent corridors means diddly squat if a school managed to change the cohort by getting rid of children in foster care or with special needs, or children from gypsy and traveller communities. Silent corridors is not an indicator of a healthy and inclusive school. We should have much higher expectations of our children. To communicate well socially, to be kind to each other and show compassion. We need to nurture our children to give them an environment like a greenhouse, warm and inviting so that they can grow into good neighbours. Not a warehouse where they're micromanaged to within an inch of their lives and they only behave for fear of what might happen to them. Learning is not just in lessons, but also in assembly, in transitions and at break times. Our kids are not perfect. They never will be. But compared with adults, they are still learning and developing into the best humans we can make them. Thirdly, how dare Gavin Williamson put the blame on children and schools when they have been starved of resources and funding for years? How dare he? Schools need funding, children need a decent place to live, and when they're suffering, agencies, which have been decimated under austerity, agencies to help them through. Zero tolerance and silent corridors is flim-flam. Our children deserve better than a politician playing roulette with their lives. Let schools educate their communities, fund them properly to do so and give them the external support they might need.
Hi Tom, Cal Graham here, just on silent corridors. We introduced them in King's Leadership Academy in Warrington about 2 years ago, and although I was initially really sceptical for a lot of the reasons that I guess a lot of people are, we actually find that based on student feedback, which we got, about 2 weeks after we implemented them, that the students were really quite keen on them continuing, for the simple reason that they believed that it kind of got rid of one of the places in the school that students would feel perhaps most unsafe, which was the corridors, which are obviously a hotspot potentially in a lot of schools for negative behaviour and bullying and whatnot. Staff feedback also saying that they believe that the students were arriving to their lessons more prepared to learn, which, to be fair, we've seen for 2 years in a row now, that the students are arriving in a really calm manner and are ready to kind of get into the lesson from the get-go, because they've not had the hyperactive energy that you perhaps would do from walking and bantering with your friends. So we found that it works really well for every reason. So it helps support staff as well with their behaviour management, because the students aren't coming in kind of really riled up. So just a few reasons from me there. There's loads of other ones, I guess, but they're kind of the main ones, I think.
Wow, what an interesting conversation there. What an interesting debate. Thank you so much to all the contributors there. We've heard from Liam Smyth, assistant head teacher in London, Damon Hesford, a teacher from Bolton, Cheryll Kidd from my current neck of the woods, Blackpool, Jules Daulby, and Carl Graham, who's up near Manchester, near Warrington. So it's been amazing to hear from all these teachers and teachers from lots of different contexts and perspectives, looking at their ideas. And a few things that I picked up on there at the end from Cheryll was really interesting about students with additional learning needs and the benefits of silent corridors for those students. I don't necessarily think that's flagged up enough in the debates that happen, is the benefits for students. She mentioned students who are autistic, but it could be students who have a range of additional learning needs, and how silent corridors might present a calmer situation for them. Equally, it was very stirring listening to Damon about kind of school cultures, and how school cultures are different, and how they can be perceived and how they can be seen. And I think silent corridors are part of that. I mentioned Jules and Cheryll both picked up on Gavin Williamson and talking about this idea of teacher autonomy and teachers having the say on these things, not politicians. Gavin Williamson, I don't know how many schools he's visited. I don't know what context of school he's visited, the kind of challenges that teachers face every day in different schools. And that would be my question to him, based on his interview that he gave and the statements he made and what was reported in Schools Week. So that's it from me for this week. I've really enjoyed this podcast. It's been brilliant. You can listen on Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, and I'll be back next weekend, unbelievably, because I had a 6-week hiatus from the podcast. Last one was in January, so I'm trying to stick to one a week, and I'll be back next week with another one, 100%. So thanks for listening, everybody, and follow the conversation at Rogers History. That's my Twitter account. So if you want to join in or post a comment about the podcast, then I will reply. So thanks very much, everybody, and see you next week.